Hello and welcome to Identity TV. Today we're talking about laying the cornerstone of your identity security foundation. My name is Neil McGlennon, our Global Field CTO, and I'm joined with Chris Gossett, our Chief Growth Officer at SailPoint. Both of us have been working with customers for well over 2 decades. We've seen a lot of what makes customers successful over these years. We've also seen some of the challenges customers have faced. We're happy to share some of those experiences with you today. Key to that success is by establishing a long-term strategy and identity security program. Identity security isn't just a one-time thing. We don't just do something once and call it good. It isn't a project, it's really a program. We need to make sure that identity security stays relevant, especially as organization changes and evolves. Systems come and go, accesses change, organization changes, or even the business lines are acquired, divested, or moved off completely.
You know, that's right, Neil. I love this topic, and I'm so excited we get to talk about it today. You know, when you think about building an identity security program from scratch, or maybe renovating an existing program, that can seem really daunting. But as with most things in IT, the first step is really assessing that current state. And in identity, that means taking kind of a wide view of the existing identity processes, looking at the end user experience, and really understanding kind of a deep look at what it really costs to do that today in your organization. If you do this right, it really highlights those key areas to focus on where you get a lot of ROI and creates a prioritized set of needs in your organization.
Yeah. Well, establishing the program's needs, we're in really a good position to really start doing something about those needs, right? And this is really where we start to talk about the implementation phase. We can spin off well-defined projects to deliver measurable results back to that identity security program. Now, the size and scope of these can vary, and it can be resourced from a variety of places. It could be internal staff, could be external staff, or even our external implementation partners. There's really a lot of options here.
Yeah, and once you do that, you're done, right? It's over, right? Yeah, maybe not quite, right? The key is, right, that continuous improvement is so important. This is a great opportunity once that initial phase is done to really learn and evolve your program. And the way to do that right is to solicit feedback, not just from the project implementation team, but from the wider business and other stakeholders as well. The keys here are really to learn and adapt your program, the priorities, and to really implement those strategic improvements to really keep up with the changing business as it evolves. And this is really the cornerstone of why we talk often about identity projects being not just that project, but actually a program. This cycle keeps repeating between assessment, implementation, improvement, and over the next few minutes, we'll dive into these areas to share what we've learned from some of the best identity teams on the planet. You know, really diving into this initial assessment, to create a really impactful identity security program, you really need that investment from the rest of the business. And this isn't just money, right? It's also about political capital. The key here is you really want to create long-term buy-in across a key set of stakeholders. And one of the other important things to note is that political capital is often the greatest at the beginning of the program. When we look at programs that really have the best ROI, they use this momentum that they start to build in the beginning to ensure the rest of the business really understands the importance of what they're doing in identity security and the critical part they play in this effort. The other thing we've learned from great identity teams is that they communicate a clear vision and they set really big goals. One of the best things about identity security programs is that they can both increase security and decrease risk while making end user experience better, making IT teams more efficient, making compliance efforts even easier than before. And again, the best programs really do a great job of explaining these benefits to the business to help ensure that they stay engaged throughout the totality of the program.
Yeah, that political capital is really important. And certainly knowing your organizational makeup and personnel is really key to establishing it further. You know, really identify key stakeholders. Go out and ask the business, right? Find out your key stakeholders, find out your business lines, your makeup of the different processes that you have in play, and how your identity program will really start to work with those, right? And beyond just figuring out what exists, but you need to also build relationships. Nurture these relationships to make sure that the visions align, both theirs and yours, and then that needs are both communicated both ways, right? You need them and they need you. And leaning into this, make sure that programs thrive and continue to evolve. You know, we also advocate creating kind of an established steering committee here, right? It's a kind of congressional representation of your stakeholders and put this on your identity program, and it gives you really a forum to drive that identity program forward.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. As you're thinking about that initial assessment, one of the things that you really want to understand is that current state, right? And most likely, you probably have many different existing solutions that are solving identity problems. So understanding the makeup of those, what value they bring, what challenges that they present to the business that remain to be solved is really critical and key. This really means taking a wide look at identity processes throughout the organization, understanding the application landscape, understanding all the different identity types, employees, contractors, vendors, and becoming more and more important, machine identities and the risks around those. When you look wider, understanding that end user experience and that total cost of ownership helps really complete that picture to really give you that 360-degree view of what the organization has today and where you can evolve it in the future. I'll also take 1 second to mention our Horizons of Identity report. If you're not using this already, it's a great tool that really helps you compare your identity program to the wider industry and does a great job of really explaining the art of the possible to the rest of the business to kind of give that, again, that complete view of what is possible and where you can go. The next step, really, once you've completed all this, is to really understand how effective is it and then map that to the wider business objectives and goals. If you think about it, this really is that successful foundation of every identity program. And if you do this right, it gives you an amazing platform to build on top of.
Yeah, that's right. And inevitably, there's going to be a lot of things to do as you get started, right? And you can really start formulating, a backlog, a roadmap of all the things to do. The first step, what we find, is just writing it down. Something very simple, right? And then the second step is really just figuring out what is most priority to you, right? And not only just to you, but also your wider business. This is where that steering committee comes back into play. And because you already have those relationships established, you can understand and represent those cross-organizational needs. And then you can also effectively communicate where they are in both your priority and theirs, and make sure that people understand how this is going to be taken care of forward. And at this point, you have a solid first start. You have the political capital, you have the relationships, and you have the roadmap to really start executing this prioritized roadmap.
Yeah, when you looking at implementation, I think when you start any kind of project that delivers back into the program, you want to make sure you've got a well-defined scope, right? You want to know where you're going to go. And we've learned that for identity projects, they really need to be thinking about focus and timely amounts of effort. So think in month-long sprints as opposed to year-long marathon. These keys really give you those clear objectives and success metrics, so it's mapped back to the program roadmap and are really easy to explain to the business.
Yeah, those success metrics are really important here. It's really part of demonstrating the value back to the business. This is things like return on investment, total cost of ownership, things like that. These can certainly be cost savings, but they could be other measurements as well, right? These could be, time saved or work done per time, resource allocated, or efficiency percentage, and much more. And so while this seems a little bit pedantic, this really helps validate the program to make sure it can thrive, longer term. And again, these wins can also be communicated back through the business so that they're understanding the value that this program is really bringing.
Yeah, I'm really glad you touched on communication, right? I think that's so key. If you think about what we're trying to do in identity is we're really mapping human processes into technology. So communication is so important, not only within the project team as it helps kind of align the project, but even beyond that. I think if you look back in the past, years ago, every identity process was customized in an identity program. Today, the best identity programs have realized they need to avoid customizations wherever possible, and that customization should really be reserved for things that truly make a difference to the business. This sounds really easy on paper, right? But in practice, knowing the difference and knowing when to customize comes from really clearly understanding the business problems that you're trying to solve, and then being able to articulate those trade-offs between those different solutions to that business. If you do this wrong, it really leads to a lot of technical debt, which we've seen can slow programs to a crawl.
Right, and part of that communication should really be setting the proper expectations, especially when you get into, customizations and things like that, right? And this is especially important to your stakeholders as well. They understand, that they expect, and they understand, what will be delivered, right? And you can set those expectations up front, like we want to minimize our customizations and things like that. And this keeps everything kind of in check, as well as, you can get delivery back to the business. No one likes surprises, and so understanding what might be changing and how, and setting those through proper communication is really ideal. And identity security program is a long-term thing. There will be many projects and implementations, and part of this roadmap, right? And so you want your program to be the best that it can be. And really, for that, you need continuous improvement. And this is something that sometimes is overlooked, but developing a culture of continuous improvement will have drastic long-term benefits. Everything is getting better.
Yeah, part of this improving is really keeping up with those success metrics and communicating widely through the organization so they understand what's going on. The other key is gathering feedback and observations around what's working, what could be improved across business lines, and not just from the team itself, but from all those relations we talked about earlier, the project, the stakeholders, the business lines, leaning into some of that political capital to make sure you're solving problems that are important to them. It's also critically important to understand what's going on in the wider business. Now, having input and awareness of key organizational changes really helps ensure that identity programs can keep up as the business changes. That seat at the table is so important because it gives identity teams input on emerging technologies like agentic AI agents or quantum encryption. And I'm sure I don't have to tell this audience that putting identity controls around new technologies early saves countless hours of time and effort down the road. And then even more importantly, it enables the business to use this new technology while still meeting audit and security controls.
Yeah, and another pro tip here is, talk about savings and repeatability, right? Let's invest in reusable frameworks here. It really helps scale your business, your process, and your program. It makes everything run better for all, and you get that. If you start very early on, you reap those benefits later. And so make templates, adapt those to your needs, create a culture around this, and you'll see things get a lot more efficient. And the earlier you start, the better, right? This process evolves as your program evolves and continues to evolve as your company evolves.
Yeah, speaking of evolution, that culture of change is so important. Both the program and the organization are going to change over time. Priorities are going to shift. And the more you think about it at the beginning of building that adaptable identity program, kind of with change in mind, the better off you're going to be.
Yeah. And adaptation isn't really done in a vacuum, It's a two-way thing with stakeholders and the steering committee. This group can be an outlet to spark and facilitate collaboration. Develop a culture of that cross-functional collaboration and make sure that those insights and the templates and all the continuous improvement needs are being addressed, right? Also, don't be afraid to seek counsel elsewhere, right? Leverage your partner networks, leverage people outside your program, especially when it involves them as stakeholders, right? They'll be happy and glad that you did.
Yeah, so this brings us to a few additional takeaways or kind of some fundamental truths maybe of identity security programs in 2025. We already touched on this a little bit, but the first one really is around change. Again, organizations are going to change, structures are going to change, people are going to change, system, access, processes. I think you get the point, like that idea shouldn't be a novelty or an aberration. It should really be built into your program. The best programs really are set up to make sure they're handling these changes, and then they're continuing improving, and really are built with that in mind. And these are the reasons, by the way, to avoid technical debt, to try to stay away from customizations, and to build that kind of political capital so you can have the bandwidth to respond to the business as it moves and changes.
Yeah, that's right. And we handle this change mainly to drive maturity. And maturity matters, right? Maturity and people and processes. This means ultimately maturity for your program and ultimately maturity for your identity security. And so keeping that eye on that maturity is really important. And maturity has significant impact to your future and what it can accomplish. And if you kind of step back and you start to look at some of the things that may get in your way, those things may seem somewhat insignificant. And so it's good to measure this from time to time. Not sure where you stand? Well, we talked about the horizons of identity maturity assessment. You can take that over and over. You can measure where your progress is and where you need to go.
That's right. Identity security is important because there's always a need for security. Threats are ever evolving. It's this ever-present need, and identity teams are being asked to play a bigger and bigger role. And if you think about it, that's why we're all here. to make sure we can handle threats against the access and identities, whether they're employees, machines, contractors. If you think about it, the fundamental goal of every identity project is really to give all of those identities the right access and only the right access to applications and data to do their job. Sometimes I think it's easy to get distracted and miss that kind of forest for the trees, but setting that as that big goal and communicating that clearly to the business really just helps make things so much easier and is really that foundation of that successful identity program.
And you don't have to just take this from us, right? I'd like to introduce you to a SailPoint customer, Inav Sharon. She's a director of the Identity Center of Excellence at Hearst. She has a fascinating story of building and growing Hearst's identity security program. Inav?
Thanks for that introduction, Neil, and hello, everyone. Hearst is one of the nation's largest and most diversified global information, services, and media companies. For over a century, Hearst has been synonymous with innovation, grounded in a clear mission to inform audiences and improve lives. Our portfolio extends across industries like finance, health, real estate, transportation, ventures, etc., and spans also 35 leading television stations, 28 daily newspapers, and more than 200 magazine editions worldwide. When we started our identity governance and administration initiative, we began by asking the right questions. How can we streamline identity processes that span such a diverse and siloed enterprise? How can we ensure alignment with Hearst's industry-specific needs? And also reviewing what technology and processes we had then. And so our journey started by discovery of the tools and processes that are tied to identity management and identifying gaps, then documenting inefficiencies and presenting our findings to executive leadership while framing the critical priorities for the business. We worked on a vision, crafting a roadmap centered on Hearst's core business values, ensuring that the vision was not just strategic, but also unique to our organization and adaptable for our future growth. Strategic execution was essential for our success in such a complex organization. From the outset, we prioritized speed without compromising quality. This focused approach allowed us to address critical areas. We did so by, first of all, establishing clarity in identity data management. That is where the identity profile is and all the identity sources that feed into it with cross-reference and verification of the information. We also worked on automating birthright access as a priority, delivering high-value process automation for efficiency gains. For example, we had a chance to work on an org-wide role-based access control for a new VPN platform, which saved a ton of time. Enhancing key identity flows, revolutionizing the basic onboarding and offboarding flows with standardized automated solutions. Those are the most basic user flows that usually have the most pain points and the most manual steps. Developing scalable services, offering customizations via web service connectors, custom reports, attestation campaigns, and reusable identity data models to empower teams in their platforms that also rely on identity data. Of course, delivering tangible, quantifiable ROIs, every iteration and improvement directly tied to measurable business outcomes, whether it is time saving, cost saving via license control, etc. The greatest insight from Hearst IGA transformation lies not in technology, but in people. Shifting entrenched processes required significant attention to change management and lots of communication. Teams across the organization became partners in the process, and their insights uncovered areas for impactful improvements, such as replacing tedious manual provisioning, standardizing identity data for accuracy and usability, iterating to ensure continued value delivery and organizational alignment. Where initial adaptation required proactive outreach and encouragement, today teams across Hearst are actively engaging with the platform, bringing aligned project ideas that enhance our collective vision. And so my key takeaways are, first of all, I would like to emphasize the need for continuous partnership and organizational change management. Our IGA journey has been so much about changing processes that people have been attached to. People have had to come along with lots of communication. And of course, listening to teams across our silos helped us identify problems that could be solved with a program. A lack of a good process, a tedious manual account provisioning, lack of good identity data, etc., were some of the opportunities we found. This in turn increased the usage of our product, generated good feedback, and of course brought value. And also how the businesses at Hearst are now reaching out and want to use the platform is very important. So to this, I will say, start with what you can control, show value, iterate, and it will get easier.
My name's Mark Williams. I'm an analyst with Devon, Cornwall and Dorset Police, so 2 police forces covering 3 counties and about 150 islands, the Isles of Scilly in the UK. We began our identity security journey with SailPoint back in late 2021, early 22, and whilst our use of ISC is probably fairly standard, our journey absolutely isn't. Policing, as you might imagine, is a highly regulated environment, and IAM forms one cornerstone of our technical delivery strategy. We're a public sector organisation, we serve the public, we use public funds, and so our standards of accountability and transparency have to be much higher than the average. It's key to have transparency and accountability in policing. ISC helps us to deliver some of that. So we've automated a lot of our JML process through the platform. And we know that develops consistency because known inputs generate known outputs. It reduces manual workload, which surprisingly people are fans of. And at the same time as reducing workload and human intervention, it also increases accuracy because we reduce that inevitable human error. It provides auditable logs for our own internal assurance and generally strengthens our internal security posture. As I say, we began that journey in late 21, but it was actually part of a national digital transformation project where all UK police forces were offered the opportunity to partner with SailPoint as an ongoing piece of work proceeded to remove access to an old application nationally and provide a new replacement. The old application was about 50 years old at the time, was accessed by just under 130 organisations and held around 135 million records. So this isn't a small piece of work. Given it was used since Nixon resigned and ABBA won Eurovision, weirdly it was considered to be legacy, and the new replacement uses new infrastructure and new access methodology, and that's designed with IAM and security at its heart. That's the thing we're using ISC for. The purpose is essentially to provide access to the appropriate data, to the appropriate people, at the appropriate time. Unfortunately, the people who need access are typically frontline police officers engaging with members of the public during their moments of crisis. So when those people most need help. We have a duty of care to the public, and ISC is helping us to support and uphold that. But it's capable of a lot more than just supporting that one national project. We're using it to deliver role-based access, RBAC, internally, to provision access and streamline permissions. We run more than 400 applications, 400 bits of software internally, some of which are commercial off-the-shelf products, many of which are bespoke and pretty unique to policing. So they're never going to integrate nicely with the standard connector suite that ISC offers. Similarly, we have probably upwards of 1,600 individual posts or roles internally. So trying to match an employment post to an ISC role, one-to-one mapping, we know that's not realistic either. So we've looked at this as a functional piece of work, trying to look at business function, need, and map team and department processes and permissions rather than individual post permissions. That's helped us cover a much wider base of the organization using RBAC, and we've integrated using Active Directory because it's common. A lot of organizations, but more than that, a lot of applications and bits of software rely on AD, so it's common. In terms of success characteristics for, say, the last year, 18 months, in 24 and 25, for that national project, we've provisioned around 12,000 permissions automatically using data from the ERP. That's either role-based data or training records and skills data. That's had no intervention from humans. In terms of local RBAC, about 85% of our joiners have been processed automatically, again, with no human input. And as a rough and really conservative estimate, it's probably saved about 3 weeks of manual work. So there's a clear impact on staff time, well-being, and our bottom line. But it's all under the one principle of trying to ensure that access is correct and present from day one. Whether that's day one of working for the organization, day one of being in a new role, or day one of needing access to a new system and new data, we're trying to ensure that every permission that's required is set up and ready from day one. It plays into our future strategies and goals too, because we're trying to roll out RBAC to the full organization, and also to gain greater coverage of all of the applications we have with a more comprehensive and granular criteria. But reflecting back on that journey so far, we've got a lot to learn, a lot still to do, but I think there are 3 key strategies I'd suggest any organisation uses to try and ensure success. The first is gaining assurance of data and processes. So data quality is key. ISC does its job really well, but it only does what it's told. If you feed bad data into it, the output is going to be unknown. So defining the processes that are used, being sure of the processes that the organisation generally uses, and then being sure of the data that you're feeding into ISC really matters. Second, to avoid scope creep, defining the scope of that work, identifying all of the stakeholders, engaging them early and regularly, and agreeing the output, agreeing what the overall goal should be. That really helps with ensuring there's as minimal scope creep as possible and ensuring that everyone's working towards a common goal. And third, collaborate and learn. It sounds cheesy, but actually understanding what other people do, understanding their jobs, understanding how they work, helps to inform both your practice and ensure that what you're doing is correct and valid. And that can be anyone from the organisation. They don't have to be technical. Quite often, non-techies have a perspective, a point of view that you'd never consider. But at the same time, partnering with organisations that are on a similar journey, trying to engage with them and learn from their mistakes and their successes, that can help with trying to find the easiest and most effective route through the challenges you face. It's one of the reasons I'm really pleased to be involved with Identity TV and SailPoint. So thank you. I'm looking forward to seeing what other organisations are doing with ISC, and please do reach out to me too.
Thank you for attending today's session. I hope you found this informative, and I look forward to seeing what transformative results you have on your identity security program.